Welcome to this webinar on the dynamics of Africa-Caribbean engagement. My name is Ivelaw Lloyd-Griffith, and I have the pleasure of serving as moderator this afternoon. Particularly the last decade or so, we have seen a resurgence in the engagement between the land that gave civilization its birth, Africa, and the Caribbean. Among the things that we can say about this re-engagement is that it's both dynamic and multifaceted. As a matter of fact, we have evidence only just recently in Barbados, this past week, of that dynamism, of that multifaceted nature of the engagement. And so the Caribbean Policy Consortium and the Institute of International Relations of the U.W.I take this opportunity to examine elements of that multifacetedness, elements of that dynamism. We have a distinguished panel to be able to lead the conversation on dynamism and multifaceted engagement between Africa and the Caribbean. And I want to take the opportunity just to briefly tell you a little bit about each of the panelists, after which I will turn to the headliner, Prime Minister Percival Patterson. Let me offer the brief introductions, understandably brief because the wealth of the experience and profile of each of the panelists will take a long time were we to do a full introduction. But let me use 1 minute to just introduce quickly each panelist, after which I will turn to our distinguished Prime Minister who is headlining. Among the things that Prime Minister Patterson has the distinction of being is the person who has served, the only person to have served 3 consecutive terms as Prime Minister of Jamaica, and had the opportunity to retire in March of 2006. And not only is he a distinguished statesman, he has benefited the region since being appointed as statesman in residence at the University of the West Indies. Welcome, Prime Minister Patterson. We'll hear from the Prime Minister shortly thereafter. One of our colleague panelists is joining us from South Africa, Dr. Adeoye Akinola. Not only is he a professor and head of research and teaching at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, but he has taught and studied and researched in Ethiopia and Nigeria as well. Editor of a distinguished journal, we will hear from Dr. Akinola also later on. We'll also have the opportunity of hearing from a distinguished diplomat scholar by the name of Ambassador Kenrick Hunte. Ambassador Hunte returned to his post at Howard University, where he's a professor of economics. Earlier, he served as Director of Graduate Studies at that institution. And between 2016 and 2020, he had the opportunity to serve as Guyana's High Commissioner and Ambassador to a variety of African countries based in South Africa, with accreditations to the Gambia, to Zambia, to Zimbabwe, and other parts of Africa. We'll hear from Ambassador Hunte also later on. But we have the opportunity also of hearing from the new interim director of the Institute, Dr. Anita Montoute. Dr. Montoute is a distinguished scholar teaching and researching on international relations, editor of 2 books. We'll hear from Dr. Montoute. She will talk to us a little bit about social and cultural dynamics of the engagement between Africa and the Caribbean. Of course, one cannot have a conversation about Africa-Caribbean engagement without talking a little bit about reparations. And to lead that conversation about reparations, we'll hear from a gentleman who is both an engineer and a businessman who has been in the practical field on the business front in Africa, having served as director not only of the African Forum, but managing director of AT&T Africa and the Middle East for a number of years, and had the distinction of being installed in April of this year in South Africa. Welcome to all members of the panel. Welcome to all who are viewing and listening, wherever part of the world you are in. I look forward to having a significant, enriching conversation about the dynamics of engagement between Africa and the Caribbean. It is my pleasure now to invite Prime Minister Patterson, who unfortunately has to leave shortly after his presentation. He has commitments that require his presence elsewhere, but I'm sure we'll have a couple of questions that we'll be able to send to his office if our others aren't able to address them this afternoon. I want to invite now Prime Minister Patterson. The floor is yours, the virtual floor is yours for your presentation.
Professor Griffith and colleagues, as statesman in residence at the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy, I truly welcome the opportunity to be a participant in this symposium on the dynamics of African Caribbean engagement. The Institute of International Relations and the Caribbean Policy Consortium deserve our heartiest commendation for this timely initiative. We, the people of African descent on this side of the Atlantic, share much more than a common ancestry and cultural origin. We have also been the victims of the most sustained and barbaric violation of human rights in the history of mankind. Africa lost an entire generation of its sons and daughters. Our ancestors were enslaved and brutalized by a common criminal system of chattel slavery. Both Africa and the Caribbean have suffered because of exploitation by European colonial powers and are scarred by the legacy of racism. Our common humanity and commitment to justice for all oblige us to pursue with the utmost urgency and with concentrated energy the irrefutable claim for reparative justice. The governments and people of both Africa and the Caribbean, as well as members of the diaspora, exist and dwell in that single planet which all mankind inhabit. But we do so in a global system which was never designed by us or for us. I therefore believe that our dynamics of our engagement must have as its central aim and overriding mission nothing less than the total reform of the existing global architecture, which is proving as the days go by that it is not only archaic and iniquitous, but obsolete and no longer fit for purpose. What is the evidence? The entire world is in unprecedented turmoil and facing the dangers of a precipitous free fall as we witness the global pandemic, the impotence of the United Nations Security Council to resolve the threat to global peace and security by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, by the consequent effect on energy prices and food supplies, with portions of the world facing hunger, by the impact of climate change simultaneously with droughts in Africa and tempestuous hurricanes in the Caribbean, and the spirals of migration by people in search of a better way of life. The 54 nations of Africa, the 14 in the Caribbean, and our diaspora have remained trapped in intolerable structural inequities for far too long. They are the direct result of the existing global configuration, which has persisted for centuries to constrain the ability of our people to achieve their legitimate right to holistic development, and resulted in inequitable access to education, to health, to shelter, to land, and reinforced by restrictive trade practices. The time has come for us to extricate ourselves from the continuation of global arrangements which were imposed in the era after World War II, when we had no presence at the table. We cannot do this individually or in a piecemeal fashion. It has to be a collective exercise among natural allies facing a commonality of interests and constraints. The imperatives are to assert a new role in global governance by collaborating of like-minded leadership, acting as a single block in concert. We must use a strategic diversification of the existing role of Africa and the Caribbean in international trade and investment relationships. This will create the context in which there can be corporate endeavor through investment in order to drive trade, services, and tourism. We can learn from the market-driven entrepreneurial energy of the entertainment sector, who are already demonstrating their creativity and agility of private enterprise by making their cultural artistry seen and enjoyed on both sides of the Atlantic. There needs to exist a consensus on the imperative need for change, the direction of such a change, and the pace at which it must be conducted. It is time to move from conception to operation by tackling specifics. One absolute necessity is transportation by air and sea. Even with the surge of technology as a marketing tool, goods, services, and particularly visitors in cultural tourism have to move physically. Air and sea transportation is circuitous at best and more often non-existent. We support the call for an African-Caribbean Transport Summit soon to provide the vehicles for travel and for trade. Impatient as we may be to engineer the traditional patterns of trade, we recognize it as a complex task which cannot be done overnight. But we have lost too much time already, and we must make a start now, mindful of an idea which emanated from Marcus Garvey and resonated with Kwame Nkrumah's dictum. The forces that unite us are intrinsic and greater than the superimposed influences that keep us apart. We need to intensify the political dialogue, the academic and cultural exchanges, the people-to-people contact through sports, culture, the arts, science, technology, and entertainment. We must encourage institutional arrangements and information by sharing among our entrepreneurs and business people the knowledge which is required. This is the context in which we meet, and I hope our discussions will proceed within this framework. Our institute stands ready with a panel of advisors, our distinguished scholars, technical experts, and friends to collaborate with governments, academia, and institutions who have demonstrated both the knowledge and the interest to advance our collective capacity in making unity of purpose and action a meaningful reality during our lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You certainly have offered us a rich menu of things in which to engage later on. And quite candidly, Prime Minister Patterson's presentation offered one set of vignettes of the multidimensionality, the multifacetedness set of vignettes about the dynamism that not only exists, but can exist. Thank you, Prime Minister. Let me invite now Dr. Akinola, Head of Research and Teaching, the Institute for Pan-African Thought, University of Johannesburg, who will examine some of the dynamic engagement in the realm of diplomatic and political relations. I invite you to take the virtual floor, Dr. Akinola.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I thank the organizer of the program for actually putting this together and for inviting me. Let me start by saying that Afro-Caribbean relations date back to the infamous epoch of the transatlantic slave trade that saw the most productive African being transported across the Atlantic to other parts of the world, including the Caribbean. The ties between Africa and the Caribbean have been erected on what Len Ishmael called a shared history, a shared ancestry, a shared culture, a shared experience, and a sense of common identity. Starting in 1502, the triangular slavery and slave trade resulted in the aggressive removal of about 10 million Africans from Africa. Several prominent Caribbean nationals, activists, and intellectuals such as George Padmore of Trinidad and Marcus Garvey of Jamaica, as well as Henry Sylvester Williams, a Trinidadian lawyer, activist, and a writer, contributed to the establishment, the evolution, and the intellectualism of Pan-Africanism, as well as the liberation of African continents from colonialism and foreign dehumanization. Indeed, the first political movements of global nature against enslavement and other institutional oppressions against the Black race, talking about the first Pan-African Congress that was held in 1900, was led from the Caribbean. The gains of the Congress were harnessed by African greats such as the late Kwame Nkrumah, leading to the hosting of the sixth Congress on African soil in early 1970s, I think 1974. While the September 2001 World Conference against racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance that was led by the United Nations and held in Durban, South Africa, revealed a political and diplomatic cracks in African-Caribbean partnership or approach to issues on slavery and colonialism, and particularly non-reparations. The two regions have been able to forge ahead to establish close political and diplomatic ties in several ways. First, diplomats and political leaders from both regions have worked together within the platform of the United Nations. CARICOM and African countries, particularly the elected representative of the United Nations Security Council, have partnered on many touchy and thorny issues, such as decolonialization, global inequality, the quest to reform the United Nations, and the reformation of the existing global economic system. Second, diplomats and political leaders from both continents have also partnered within the platform of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Group, also within the Commonwealth and within the non-aligned movements. Few Caribbean countries such as Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago have resident diplomatic missions in South Africa and Nigeria. And South Africa and Nigeria also have resident diplomatic missions in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, just to enhance diplomatic and political relations among between the two continents. We also know that at the height of the draconian subjugation of some parts of Southern Africa by colonial and apartheid powers, Caribbean countries, particularly Cuba, were involved in the liberation battle, and Cuba strongly supported the African National Congress Party of South Africa to rid the society of minority rule, leading to a democratic republic of South Africa. I've also benefited from this because here I am in South Africa because of those great battles that were fought and won by both Africans and African diaspora. While leaders from the regions engage bilaterally through diplomatic relations and associate memoranda, the Caribbean community has particularly tried to enhance relations with Africa through the African Union, the AU. The first CARICOM African Summit held virtually in September last year, 2021, under the theme Unity Across Continents and Oceans, Opportunity for Deepening Integration. And this summit served to give impetus to the relations and accelerated deeper engagement between head of states from both regions. The summit also gave birth to African Caribbean Day, which was celebrated just yesterday, 7th September. In 2019, discussions on CARICOM African cooperation made progress as the presidents of Ghana and Kenya visited the Caribbean. And following other visits to African countries, the Prime Minister of Jamaica and Barbados also attended the 9th ACP Summit held in Nairobi, Kenya, to deepen and enhance political relations with African countries. Despite the intensification of a series of conversations about partnerships, in concrete terms, the political and diplomatic relations between the regions have been very difficult to measure in terms of genuine and concrete deliverables. As reiterated over the decades, trade and commerce between the CARICOM and African countries have been particularly weak, perhaps due to a lack of effective commitments. It could be the distance, and particularly the difficulty in terms of transportation. And I love it because the former speaker just touched on these aspects of same issues of transportation that I'm trying to raise here. However, there have been efforts at dramatically improving these asymmetrical relations between the two regions in terms of trade partnership. For instance, the first Africa-Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum under the tag One People, One Destiny, Uniting and Reimagining Our Future was held just recently, just this month in September. Furthermore, most engagements have ended at the level of diplomatic talks and meetings without conversion of promises to action points or genuine and measurable collaborative missions. Indeed, partnerships between both regions will require first the identification of specific areas of cooperation and issues of common agenda followed by genuine commitments by the political leaders of both regions. It also requires investments of time, attention to detail, and strong political will to systematically transform the relationship into an effective and beneficial political, social, and economic force, big enough to also transform the dreams of the two regions and their people into reality. The calls for the direct integration of the two economies seems too ambitious at this stage. Rather, specific targets, such as the destruction of neo-imperialism, or what some other people refer to as pseudo-colonialism, and other forms of subjugation of African people should be identified and pursued. Of note is this current situation in Haiti, in the Caribbean, and the disputed Chagos Island in Africa. These two are the areas, specific areas of common interest that should attract the attentions of our political elites and Caribbean and African diplomatic community. Thank you. I will rest my case for now.
Professor Griffith, you're muted.
I thank you, Dr. Akinola, and I want to say that not only have you rested your case, but you made a wonderful case that builds on an element of what Prime Minister Patterson said when he said the international architecture was never designed by us or for us. And among other things, you have showed that there have been consistent efforts to erode that international architecture that was not designed by us or for us. I want to thank you for your presentation. But not only have we seen the dynamism and multifacetedness in the political diplomatic realm, as Dr. Akinola has demonstrated, not only do we know from what Prime Minister Patterson tells us, there's a global architecture dimension where the dynamism that has been there, not in our best interests, the dynamism and multifacetedness of Africa-Caribbean engagement also exists in the trade and economic realm. We saw last week, for example, at the forum in Barbados, the report from the International Trade Center that showed that more than 1 billion in export potential across a range of goods exists between Africa and the Caribbean. So the dynamism, the multifacetedness is there in that economic sphere. And I'm delighted now to invite Ambassador, Professor, Doctor, he's all those, Kenrick Hunte, to share with us whatever he has in mind as regards economic and trade matters, Africa and the Caribbean. The floor is yours, Kenrick.
Thank you. 1 second. Thank you, Professor Griffith, and chair of this afternoon's proceedings. I'd like to make a short presentation on some of the matters that cover the economics that we see in the region. Let me just go to my first slide here. I had a problem. Sorry about this. So, yes. So basically, what I would like to address is how we would set out what is a destination in the Caribbean and Africa, what should be the focus of our program. And I've listed a few things here. First, we focus on a people-centered growth, food security, poverty reduction, enhanced life expectancy, access to healthcare and educational services, and a whole host of other things that are related to that. We speak also focusing on what the blue economy should do for us, the flora, the fauna, the marine life. Those are things that are critical as we look forward to our next century and where we want to go. We're looking for better deals in the use of our non-renewable resources. And we have not been given the best deals when we consider what's out there for that. Debt service suspension is another critical concern, given the concerns we have with COVID, high oil prices, the war in Ukraine, drought, heat waves, fires, and of course, climate change, all bundled into one concern, has affected some of the economic concerns that we see at the current time. When we talk about the requirements, what it is we need to do together, we want strong collaborative institutions that are transparent in their actions and held accountable for the results in a timely manner. I emphasize timely manner. That has been a problem. We cannot have a late response to what we need to get answers to help us solve our problems. We want to incentivize certain job opportunities for workers in non-traditional fields. I know when I say this, some of my friends in law and medicine will not like me thereafter, but hey, I must say it. We must have some more emphasize the other incentives, the other sectors, to bring those sectors along with skills in those areas, or we'll continue to lose those persons to the north and to Europe. The agreement in Caribbean and African governments, together with buy-ins from African and Caribbean diaspora institutions, are critical. It mustn't be a top-down, this must be a bottom-up with institutional connections with all the various communities working together. And of course, we must have what I call a World Wide Web to convey our African Caribbean diaspora stories 24/7, 365, facilitating the flow of news, information, artistic programming between CARICOM and Africa in order to robustly tell our own stories. I'll come back to this a short while from now. And of course, I put this map here to just remind people of how large Africa is. It's one of the stories I didn't know till I left high school a long time after, to find out that everything in Europe could fit in Africa 2-3 times in space left over. And of course, the big story here is flying from North Africa to South Africa is 8 hours. So if you live in the United States and you live in New York and you fly to California and back, where you just really made one trip from the top of North Africa to the bottom, South Africa. It's that big. And people need to understand the size and the uses and the resources on the continent for us to get a better understanding of what it is we have. Again, whoever controls your story controls your mind. We must tell our own stories. I'm going to come back to that as well. So where we are today and what are the first steps? Now, recognizing that the Caribbean and Africa produce what I call primary commodities, we got to work on a couple of things that I've identified here. We want to incentivize businesses to manufacture final goods. We want to build a reliable transportation system. We want to facilitate the establishment of a CARICOM African Union. And that is very critical for the economic advancement that we're going to be looking at with some evidence later on. Now, expanding what's the evidence for this? We've seen recently that it's just spoken to by previous speakers. The African Export-Import Bank signed an agreement with Dominica and several other Caribbean countries this past week. And again, we're trying to build the cooperation between the various places. We want to prioritize public-private partnerships dedicated to mobilizing resources and deploying the same in critical cutting-edge projects, particularly energy, manufacturing, agricultural processing, the creative industries, and digital technology. Those are the future of where we should be heading in building up the kind of capacity we want to see it be collaborated between the two places. We want to initiate a multilateral air services agreement and a maritime as well, investment protection, and a double taxation agreement between African and CARICOM states, and eliminate visa requirements of nationals of CARICOM and Africa. We shouldn't have visa restrictions on people from CARICOM and Africa. That should be a standard story. I just arrived, I walk through the airports wherever I go. My identification is that I'm African, I'm Caribbean, and I'm done. That is critical for building the kind of cooperation we need. Now, for institutional strengthening, this is very critical. As I said, we need a bottom-up, wide open space to have everybody come in from their various expertise. So I talk here about CARICOM and the African Union. They are more or less the guiding institutional arrangements to set policy, to set rules and laws. And then after that, we look at economic institutions, CSME, which is the Caribbean version of the equivalent in South Africa of many of them like SACU and ECOWAS. They need to work together. I'll come back to them in a short while too as well. We need to build a single market for the free movement of goods, people and services, intellectual property rights, investment in digital trade, negotiate trade rules to eliminate trade barriers, and have a dispute settlement mechanism. We also need the development banks in the regions in both Africa and the Caribbean to work together because there's so much things to be done in those particular areas. Of course, the universities too need to work together to help iron out and identify where we need to be going with research and what it is that we need to understand for the various communities that we have. Research in environmental institutions also part of this. As you know, both Africa and the Caribbean has a strong set of what I call environmental responsibilities, given where we are for both flora, fauna, and marine life. And we need to understand how we can work in those areas as well. And of course, African Caribbean private sector businesses need to get together. We've seen some of that this past week in the conference in Barbados. And of course, cultural associations converting what we call art, music, food, dance, and sports. We need to focus on some of these things through the various institutions that we have. Now, we have some other things to deal with, specifically when I look at the requirements of what is done by certain countries. They have the common external tariff in some places. I give an example of that later on. A common pool of custom duties is as per the total volume of external trade. Excise duties based on total production and consumption and excisable goods. And free movement of SACU manufactured goods within SACU. I'll mention again, SACU is a special agency consisting of 5 African countries that are doing significant work that we could all learn from, particularly CSME. I'll come back again to that shortly. And here are some what I call income enhancing information, which I'll present for you to take a look at. The average per capita income in SACU countries, of course, these are South Africa, Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Namibia. We want to look at that as well as compare what we see in the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. They run a set of countries together. They run through one central bank, and I list the countries in the Caribbean that belong to that. You'll see why I kind of emphasize these 2 particular places, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank and the SACU group of countries. And generally, what we're going to find is that working together across borders enhances average per capita income. And let me just show you some of that information here. Yes, this table, let me just run this through quickly. I've looked at some data from the World Bank, taking the average per capita income from 2015 to 2021. You'd see here, the average per capita income in landlocked African countries is $1,406 for that period. The average per capita income in Africa, the entire Africa, is $2,382. So it's a little higher across there, as you recognize that the landlocked African countries are hold over from colonialism, with these borders drawn to get the maximum amount of resources to the people involved. They ended up at the bottom of the scale here. And then you'd see, this is the interesting point. In non-landlocked African countries, the average per capita income there is $2,800, $2,880. And then look at this particular case. The average per capita income in landlocked countries that belong to SACU, which are Botswana, Lesotho, and Eswatini, and I'm the other one right now. So you see them that their average per capita income is $3,982. So working together in this institution, they have been able to generate a higher level of income, even though they are landlocked. And if you compare the landlocked are way down here, they're like 3 times lower than where they are. And the average per capita income in SACU is again one of the highest in Africa. So we're getting evidence of where we should be heading in terms of uniting across borders to get things organized on the continent. And the Africa Free Trade Area arrangement is the overall guiding light in that direction. But I don't stop there. Let's look at the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, the average per capita income for the world is $11,045. And this again for the period 2015-2021. Average per capita income CARICOM for that period is $11,400. But look at this, the average per capita income in Eastern Caribbean countries that I just mentioned, they, by working together, have a higher average per capita income. And this again is an indication of working across borders, and in this case, they're using the currency and a unified way in which they handle their finances and their funding through a central system, generating some additional income. And again, this is proof of working together. We can do a lot better for the communities. As I said, getting rid of the borders, that the colonial borders that were drawn in Africa, and putting them in a SACU and the Africa Free Trade Area arrangement could change the dynamics. And that dynamics is built on strengthening infrastructure trade across borders and unifying the financial and resource requirements that are needed. So again, let me just move on to my next slide. Expanding transportation services. This was identified earlier by previous speakers. We know of the significant history of transportation across the Atlantic. And more recently, I can tell you, the work done by Cuba in helping the end apartheid, where they transshipped soldiers to get things done to free Southern Africa, is well known. Some of the countries in the Caribbean helped by assisting with transshipment arrangements. Guyana was one of them, and they stopped in Cape Verde because they didn't have planes to make the straight flight at the time. They used an old British war plane to get most of the troops in and out. And that's a story that most people do not know about, but that's part of the story. And more recently here, Antigua and Barbuda said a new airline will soon be permitted to operate flights from West Africa direct to the Caribbean. And only recently, August 31st this year, Ethiopian Airlines landed in Grantley Adams International Airport in Barbados. The first flight was just 8 hours from Lagos, Nigeria, transporting 130 passengers and from several West African countries. So essentially what has happened here is that instead of having to go through Europe and North America to Africa, you can get the job done in 8 hours. We know if you fly there, you got to fly to Europe, and it's more than a day plus to get there on the current arrangements. Now, so what do we need going forward? We know that the technology for flying and stuff is available. The task right now is to check the financial viability for transportation services, as this will be a welcome development for trade, cultural, education, tourism exchanges. And if financially viable, discussions will begin to talk about a multilateral air services agreement. And of course, the marine transportation, which again was also referred to previously, will have to satisfy the same tests of financial viability before progress can be made in this area. But I'm just presenting some of the things where I feel we need to proceed to get things done. Now, climate change was referred to, and this is a major concern. In East Africa, again, somebody referred to the drought and concerns there for famine and hunger there as a result of a major drought situation. And I also read not so long ago in the Caribbean, there's a problem with water, fresh water, because the aquifers are not being replenished as quickly because of the changes in rain patterns. And of course, at the same time, you have shortages of fresh water in Guyana. For the last couple of years now, they've been having excessive rainfall. And I think they said they had the highest rainfall for the last 40 years happening in the last 2-3 years. And they used in Guyana, we had 2 seasons of rain, but now it's almost every day that they're getting downpours. And one of the reasons for this too is that with the cutting of the forest and the burning of the forest in Brazil, a lot of the rains now are moving further north, and therefore Guyana is getting a lot more fresh water as rain taken off in those areas. And the question is, how do we deal with this concern? One of the things here I identify is, similar to oil tankers, should we be doing water tankers? Is water more expensive than gasoline? I think if you check now, we're heading in that direction. As the supply of fresh water becomes scarce, this will be a serious concern going forward. Apart from salt water being filtered through a desalination process, there's no substitute for fresh water. So we got to solve this problem, and we got to work on it quickly, because the climate change issues are not going to disappear. Now, what's the way forward? We need a feasibility study to ascertain the merits and financial viability of building water tankers, as climate change could be around for some time. We certainly consider transporting water from Guyana and Suriname to the Caribbean. The consequences of not having fresh water will be significant. I will not specify that in any more detail. And of course, in Africa to deal with the problem in Eastern Africa, where many countries have had the problem of the drought, and also they've suffered with locust infestation, which is another problem that's causing serious problems of food and things of that sort. I'm dealing wholly now with the Nile. If the water from the Nile could be redirected after some feasibility study is done, and of course I'm saying after the use in hydropower, because electricity generation is very important, if some of that water could be redirected to the eastern part of Africa, we can then deal with some of the concerns that climate change has brought about, and with the concern for hunger and starvation. We have to change the way in which we look at the continent. And I said, moving away those temporary colonial borders and allowing things to flow in a different direction, we can make progress. And the Africa Free Trade Area Association is one of the things I'm hoping that can happen in that area, and also working through other arrangements that can help. Now, financial markets. This is an interesting story. The Republic of Bank in Trinidad and Tobago has become a major shareholder in a bank in Ghana. And there's a big change where, for the first time, I believe, a Caribbean entity has been investing in an African country. This is perhaps a new addition to what we should be thinking about, and in strengthening and deepening the financial arrangements. So going forward, there are some possibilities here for incentive, what we need to incentivize business development and investment in financial markets to deal with some of those opportunities in both places. Of course, the Caribbean exports primary commodities as well as the African. We send away our raw materials, and then we have to re-import them as final goods. This has to change, and this is one of the things we should be looking at. And basically, when we look at foreign investors, when they come to the region and in Africa, these are the criteria they're looking at. They want to maximize shareholders' earnings. They want to maximize the extraction of minerals in the shortest possible time. They use government guarantees, concessions such as tax holidays on profits and imports, with the understanding that when the tax holiday period ends, they will pay taxes. I have a concern with that. The profitable amount of resources could be extracted before the date of the tax payment, and this has been, in some cases, an experience. Hence, no taxes are collected. And I have a little diagram which I want to just go through quickly. Essentially, what this diagram shows, oops, sorry, 1 second here, oops. Essentially, what my diagram shows is that when the contracts are signed, you have a certain rate at which they will extract the resources, and a certain time which they'll get a free tax, no taxes will be paid. Then after a certain amount of time, you're then supposed to start collecting taxes. So what usually happens, they begin with the contract, say, yes, we're going to start at this rate of extraction, but then they speed up the extraction rates. And so before you can get to the year when you're supposed to be collecting taxes, they already have extracted what is commercially quantities that could make a profit for themselves. So by the time they get to the period when they should be paying taxes, they're ready to leave, and you're left with nothing. So essentially what we need to see happen here is that CARICOM and Africa need to share information and collaborate on the extraction of non-renewable resources so that an equitable share of non-renewable resources remain in Africa and the Caribbean. Enhanced contracts are therefore required, since a hole in the ground is negative intergenerational wealth for future generations. We're in a bad state, and we have to change that. I go to a particular story here dealing with clay products. This is something that we in the Caribbean have seen in the past. In the 100 years during the colonial time and slavery, the boats coming from Europe to extract sugar from the region put what we call clay bricks in the boats to stabilize them. When the boats were arrived in the region, the clay bricks were taken off and they used them for buildings. And that's what's happened for a number of years. And we do have a lot of buildings still in the region made with clay bricks. The concern I have here is that clay bricks got a lot of potential for dealing with environmental problems and intergenerational wealth. If you look at that concern from the little information I presented, and the two buildings below are clay bricks buildings that we have, that you can have expertise and technology from Africa that very good and useful that can be used in the region. Again, the key concern here is if you use clay bricks, which got all these environmental advantages, the outside understanding of this is the intergenerational wealth that you can pass down. And if you could put that in the context, in some places where you have homes only built of wood and cement, which is not a problem, which is not environmentally friendly as clay bricks, we know we have some opportunities there. And there's an opportunity for business investment, again, linking the regions together. Particularly Southern Africa has the technology, and we need to look in this direction for dealing with it. When you go to the region, the Caribbean, you see lots of buildings built of clay brick, churches and other places of meetings. You can see the buildings that were built more than 100 years ago, 200 years ago in some cases. I'm just raising this as an issue. Now, we also have in the region, we had this case of vaccine procurement. During the COVID pandemic, the Caribbean was able to procure COVID vaccines from Africa. And the concern we had was that we needed to deal with what we call procurement troubles and high vaccine costs. And the African Medical Supplies Platform helped the region. And this was something that Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister from Trinidad and Tobago mentioned and gives specific mention at the Caribbean Africa Summit, in which he thanked this particular agency for working with us. Buying through that arrangement allowed us to get vaccines in the region. But then the story was, we did not know, again, across the board, where this stuff came from. It wasn't properly what we call advertised in the news programs that we have. And again, if you don't tell your own stories, you're gonna have a problem. So benefits for this new network, which I'm hoping that come into play, is to facilitate the flow of news, information, and artistic programming in the Caribbean and Africa. Such program can bring clarity to Caribbean, African, and diaspora issues, foster integration, understanding, and togetherness, and be a permanent home for circulating our history, culture, and economic news. And I cannot end this section without referring to the concept explained and presented by Marcus Garvey. A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. We have to change this. We have to change this, and a key institution for that is our, what I call a Caribbean Africa News Network that is on the World Wide Web to get our stories out there, because nobody else is going to do it for our benefit. Now, cultural exchanges, I know that someone will be speaking on this. I just remembered that this year, we're at CariFesta, we celebrated 50 years of CariFesta. What I like to see happen is that we should have a Caribbean Africa Union celebration of cultures, art, music, food, dance, whatever. We need to work at the cultural level to get things done. And finally, I would say that the Caribbean Africa collaboration must be focused on people-centered growth and development in every aspect of our lives. And we must tell our own stories. In this regard, we must have a well-functioning CARICOM African Union electronic mass media platform that facilitates the flow of news, information, artistic programming between CARICOM and Africa. The time is now, the wait is over. Get busy, Africa CARICOM. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambassador Hunt. There again, ladies and gentlemen, we see not only the multifaceted elements of the economic trade arena, but the dynamism. And part of the dynamism is not only dynamism in regards to government engagement. You see the extent to which there is public-private, but also private-private engagement. Thank you again, Ambassador Hunt. One of the things that Ambassador Hunt talked about in the latter part, actually in the last slide, is the people-centeredness of economic development. And I think that observation dovetails nicely with what we're going to hear from Dr. Anita Montoute. Because the harsh reality is, whatever part of the world you're focusing in, people are at the center of the dynamic engagement. And I'm delighted now to invite Dr. Montoute, newly minted acting director of the Institute of International Relations, to share with us whatever she has in mind regarding the social and economic dynamics of Africa-Caribbean engagement. The virtual floor is yours, Dr. Montoute.
Thank you very much, Professor Griffith. If the IT personnel can put up the slide, I'll be looking at social and cultural dynamics of the African-Caribbean relationship. Social and cultural relations between Africa and the Caribbean are institutionalized at the governmental level, which provides a framework for people-to-people relations and reinforces social and cultural links. At the same time, even before these established frameworks, groups and peoples of the two regions had always interacted. Today, Africans on the continent and in the diaspora in the Caribbean continue to forge these links. Please move the slide twice for me, please. That was supposed to have been the first slide that I read. Thank you. In the African Union, the Citizens and Diaspora Organizations Directorate is responsible for implementing the African Union's vision of a people-centered and driven organization based on a partnership between governments, civil society, and diaspora. The Directorate consists of the Civil Society and Diaspora divisions. The Diaspora division of the AU serves as the focal point and hub for implementing the African Union's decision to invite and encourage the African diaspora to participate in the building and development of the African continent. Its main objective is to serve as a catalyst for rebuilding the global African family. The Civil Society Division is responsible for mainstreaming civil society engagement into the AU's processes, departments, and organs. It also has a unit that serves as a secretariat of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. The council, which is composed of civil society organizations and non-state organs, was established in 2004 as an advisory organ in the African Union. Well, we all know in 2006, the AU amended its constitutive act to include the African diaspora as a sixth region of Africa. The Global African Diaspora Summit was held in 2012. At that summit, leaders acknowledged the need to celebrate and preserve the shared heritage between Africa and the peoples of African descent in the diaspora. They expressed the need to build on those efforts to establish a foundation for rejuvenating the global Africa family and for pursuing the African Renaissance. They committed to cooperate in the political, economic, and social realms. So as my presentation is on social and cultural dimensions, I want to just look at some of the areas on the social cooperation. And they're under several headings in the area of knowledge and education. They are committed to look into platforms for African and diaspora education and scholars to address the development agenda of the continent and the diaspora. These would include, among others, the establishment of African-centered institutions and programs and increased collaboration efforts between academic and research institutions in Africa and the diaspora regions. Harmonization and implementation of regional and international protocols protecting indigenous knowledge systems and intellectual property rights. They emphasize the importance of education as a basic condition of achieving human development and the need to promote literacy campaigns, support the creation of linkages between diaspora academic research and development institutions and those in Africa, ensure the participation of diaspora experts in the development and implementation of AU diaspora initiatives. Under arts and culture, funding of cultural exchange programs between Africa and the diaspora, support, encourage, and promote the celebration of global observance days as symbols of solidarity for the common heritage and vision of Africa and its diaspora in order to strengthen Pan-African unity and identity such as Emancipation Day. On the media and image building, coordinate efforts of the existing media and promote new media to rebrand Africa to counter stereotypes about Africans and people of African descent. Explore possibilities of creating African News Network service to enhance image branding and imaging of Africa. Promote national and continental initiatives that aim to enhance good governance and rule of law so as to strengthen a positive image of Africa among the African diaspora and the international community at large. There is something on the immigration that is to engage developed countries with a view to creating favorable regulatory mechanisms governing migration and to address concerns of African migrants in diaspora communities. On the human rights and people's rights, to work for the full implementation of the Plan of Action of the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, engage developed countries to address the political and social economic marginalization of diaspora communities in these countries of domicile, strengthen the implementation of legislation and other measures aimed at eradicating child trafficking, human trafficking, child labor, exploitation of children and women in armed conflicts and other modern forms of slavery. And finally, on the social and cultural issues, to allocate more resources on social spending programs such as health, education, and housing, cooperate in order to make social security institutions more efficient in protecting Africans and members of the diaspora, ensure expansion of access to the internet for social, health, and business and development and trade, coordinate with the African diaspora regarding the question of illegally acquired cultural goods that exist outside the African continent with the aim of speeding their return to their countries of origin in Africa. And finally, ensure the promotion of sports and sports exchange between the AU member countries and the diaspora. Now, the climax of existing efforts towards forging relations with Africa and the diaspora in the Caribbean was the first CARICOM Africa Summit hosted by Kenya, held virtually in 2021, as my fellow panelists have mentioned. This took place during the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent. Leaders committed to strengthen collaboration and unity and to foster increased trade, investment, and people-to-people engagement between the two regions. Speakers noted that African and Caribbean cultural and political ties run deep based on a shared history, culture, as well as a sense of common identity. They cited common historical experiences which inspired the Pan-African movement championed by the Africans and the diaspora, and which established the foundations of a rich and vibrant African-Caribbean relationship. The leaders expressed the view that they were obligated to build on that vision. Next slide, please. Following the 2012 summit, the Caribbean Pan-African Network, or CPAN, embarked on a diaspora engagement program in the Caribbean region. CPAN was established as a mechanism to facilitate the Caribbean region's engagement with the African continent in general and the African Union in particular. In December 2015, the Citizens and Diaspora Directorate of the African Union Commission, CARICOM, and the Caribbean Pan-African Network had discussions on critical areas to strengthen the relationship between the African Union and the African diaspora community in the Caribbean. At that meeting, CPAN was invited to accelerate the process of sensitization and coordination that would allow full participation of Caribbean civil society stakeholders in the activities and processes of the organ. In 2021, the inaugural African-Caribbean People-to-People Forum was held. It was organized by the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council of the African Union, the Caribbean Pan-African Network, CPAN, and the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. The forum was the outcome of discussions between the AU Economic, Social, and Cultural Council and the Caribbean Pan-African Network in September 2020, where the meeting agreed to coordinate in the following areas: cultural heritage and exchanges, cultural heritage exchanges, a people-to-people forum as part of the annual Trinidad and Tobago Pan-African Festival, commemorating emancipation, and developing and advancing African-centered content in formal education systems in Africa and the Caribbean. The People-to-People Forum was proposed as part of the annual Trinidad and Tobago Pan-African Festival commemorating emancipation. The Pan-African Festival is an annual festival hosted by the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago. A major component of the festival is the AU Diaspora Forum, which brings relevant stakeholders to discuss issues relating to strengthening the relationship between AU and the diaspora, and also seek solutions to common challenges. These fora have for many years included the physical participation of persons from Africa, including representation of organs of the African Union and members of CPAN. It was agreed that the AU Diaspora Forum would be further developed into the People-to-People Forum and be institutionalized at the annual festival. The People-to-People Forum provides an appropriate platform for building relationships, sustaining dialogue, closer interaction, solidarity, and collaboration among the governments and civil society of Africa and its diaspora. The People-to-People Forum was held at a time when there were ongoing efforts between the Caribbean community and the African Union to develop a memorandum of understanding towards strengthening strategic alliances and partnerships for the benefit of the peoples of the African and Caribbean regions. Can you please change the slide? Emancipation Day celebrations have helped cement African-Caribbean links. August 1st is celebrated throughout the Anglophone Caribbean. In Trinidad and Tobago, the annual Pan-African Festival has provided the opportunity to promote and sustain Caribbean, Africa, and African linkages. The festival also hosts performers from Trinidad and Tobago, Africa, and other parts of the African diaspora, and celebrates African cultural heritage. Visual displays focus on areas as African history and African contributions to science and technology from ancient to modern times. The Emancipation Day Parade is dominated by African textiles, designs, and theater. This cultural show generates income to many who sell African goods at the festival's market. Out of this, many small African businesses have been set up in Trinidad and Tobago, restaurants, shops selling oils, soaps, garments, etc. The Pan-African Festival has also been a catalyst for Caribbean artists to penetrate the African market. Caribbean artists have also taken to African rhythms and vice versa. Africa has been hailed as a new frontier for artists to place their focus. In this regard, Jamaican artists have called for direct flights to Africa, which we see mushrooming or at least beginning to happen. As in other countries around the world, the steel pan has been embraced on the African continent. African films have permeated the Caribbean region and are widely viewed among the population. The 2022 edition of the African film Trinidad and Tobago, African film Trinidad and Tobago took place in Port of Spain from May 24th to 28th and showcased a mix of contemporary and classic films from the continent alongside local and regional films highlighting issues relevant to the Afro-Caribbean experience. In the area of education, we have a number of arrangements between universities. And the first one I want to highlight is the PJ Patterson Institute for African-Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies, which aims to centralize and coordinate its relations with African peoples, governments, universities, and institutions through a specialized institutional agreement. In 2017, the U.W.I and the University of Lagos in Nigeria signed an MOU for the establishment of the University of Lagos U.W.I Institute of African and Diaspora Studies. Another example, prominent example, is the Institute for Global African Affairs, which was launched in November 2018. It is a collaboration between the university and the University of the West Indies and the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. And there are other examples, there are many other examples on a personal level where scholars from the Caribbean are doing fellowships in African universities and vice versa. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I thank you, Dr. Montoute, for that additional example of the multifaceted, the dynamic engagement between Africa and the Caribbean, even if one were to limit one's purview to the social and cultural sphere. Thank you. When Dr. Akinola spoke, he cited the year 1502 as the genesis of Africa-Caribbean engagement. And he cited that year because it was the beginning of the transatlantic slave. And that transatlantic experience is what, among other things, has led to the next speaker's mission and mandate in relation to reparations. And so we're going to hear next from someone who is not only graced the cover of Business Week International and Black Engineer magazine, but I think he distinguishes himself among this panel as being the only chief. And so let me invite Chief Sipho Zulu of South Africa to tell us what he has in mind regarding the business of reparations. Mr. Phillips is both the vice chair of the Caribbean Reparations Committee and the chair of the Guyana Reparations Committee. The floor is yours, the virtual floor is yours, Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Professor Griffith. I'm also thankful that when you initially introduced me, you mentioned I was an engineer. Because being the last speaker, I'd like to use that approach to discuss reparations. Because we need to look at cause and effect. We need to look at critical paths if we're going to succeed, and we need to deal with facts. As you know, we're in the 8th year of the International Decade for People of African Descent, and that has the theme Recognition, Justice, and Development. This much heralded decade has dramatically revealed the dynamics of Africa-Caribbean relationships. Here we had a framework in which Africa and the Caribbean could have gotten many things done, but in reality, very, very little was done. Apart from the government of Guyana providing $500,000 US a year to a group to promote this decade, there was nothing else in the Caribbean. In Africa, apart from the year of return in Ghana, which was for all intents and purposes a tourist strategy, very little was done in Africa. Except, of course, over the last 2 years, we've seen some activity. So we've had the 7th of September 2021, we had a heads of state meeting between Africa and the Caribbean. I listened into that. I read the communique. There were many things promised, but there was no structure put in place to execute. Again, just recently this year, we had an Africa-Caribbean Trade and Investment Summit with the theme One People, One Destiny. This was in Barbados, and we had over 1,000 online participants from Africa. Additionally, over the last couple of years, we've seen some activity in terms of African Caribbean connectedness. We saw Barbados embassies being set up in Ghana and Nairobi. But the question is, why not in Nigeria? Why not in South Africa? Why not in Botswana? Why not in Egypt? So there is activity, but I'm not certain if that activity will lead to some critical path. Of course, reparations have been fundamental to the relationships between Africa and the Caribbean for quite a while. The first Pan-African Conference on Reparations was held in 1993, the Abuja Declaration. And of course, as you could see from this presentation, we've had many, including just the 1st of August this year, where we had a meeting hosted by the President of Ghana, which spoke about reparations. And at that particular conference, let me go back here, His Excellency Nana Akufo-Addo stated that it's time for the Africa Union to make reparations in the Caribbean a priority. And there's also some talk about reparations for Africa. Of course, culturally, we've had several things going on. Just recently in Guyana and Antigua, we had a royal delegation of traditional kings and queens. Here are the pictures of some of the kings, 2 kings, 2 queens. We had 2 princesses and a business person. And so culturally, much is happening and much has happened. And we know from history that we have had between Africa and Caribbean very great political, cultural, aspirational bonds. We know of Marcus Garvey, we know of Angola, we know of the Rastafari culture. But critically, we also know that many great minds from the Caribbean were thought leaders for African independence, African self-government, and human rights for Africans. And we could look at this list here, and you could see all the names of Caribbean leaders, intellectuals, historians, and musicians who have supported the liberation of Africa. And I'm bringing this up because I want to get to the position to saying, where are these structures? Where is this momentum that we've had? Of course, our musicians have always celebrated Africa. Rastafari, you look at these artists, Peter Tosh, Look at Bob Marley. You see that we've always had that cultural link, and that continues in the way we dress. We've also had strong political and diplomatic efforts in the past. You look at the war in Southern Africa. And of course, we had the issue with cricket, where there was a statement made about South Africa apartheid and how the Caribbean stands with Africa. Of course, historically, if you were to look at a model, we would recognize that Marcus Garvey and UNIA-ACL epitomized the promise and the potential for very strong and mutually beneficial Africa-Caribbean relationships. And of course, over the years, Africa and the Caribbean have had interchanges. We had teachers from Jamaica and Guyana, as well as nurses, go to Botswana, and there was much achieved. But in reality, when we look at truth, we will realize that Africa has underinvested in the Caribbean, given the role of Cuba, Guyana, Barbados, Trinidad, Jamaica, and many other islands in the Caribbean, the roles they've played in Africans' independence and the quest for African freedom and economic development. So despite the historical and cultural ties, economic cooperation between the regions have been negligible. And of course, when you go to the literature, you've seen that many recent scholars have proposed solutions to strengthen the dynamism, to strengthen the integration, to strengthen activity. We had Dr. Sandra Ochieng Springer, who said there is a potential for a free trade area between AFCTA and CARICOM. That makes a lot of sense. Ainsley Brown has called for an Africa-Caribbean Economic Engagement Network, comprising trade agreements, investment treaties, mutual recognition agreements, air service agreements, double taxation agreements. These are things that make things happen. And Brandon Sullivan, of course, spoke about the digital divide and how CARICOM and Africa could work towards that. The issue is that we talk a lot, and we have many strategies, but we don't see the structures in place. Structures follow strategy. And so positive and sustainable improvements in the dynamics of African-Caribbean engagement will occur if and only if there's an internalized and actionable reality that Africans throughout the world and in the diaspora have a common destiny, racially, economically, diplomatically, and culturally. We don't seem to have that glue. We also have to, it will only succeed if and only if African and Caribbean leaders commit to developing a domestic African-owned and controlled business community that could become exporters and have international, multinational, and global companies. If you look at African countries and you look at Caribbean countries, we know that the status quo excludes Africans from being in that economy. I can explain well in Guyana, where we have oil, we can grow 200 fruits and vegetables, we have incredible natural resources, but 80% of that lies in non-African hands. So if you're speaking about Africa and Caribbean engagements, you have to first build the infrastructure locally. So there's really a lot of potential. And as I said just previously, unless governments are willing to provide affirmative actions to their own African businesses in the Caribbean and in Africa, this whole issue of Africa to Africa trade will only benefit others because they control the economic architecture of both African countries and countries in the Caribbean. And this is a reality. So for strong mutually beneficial economic relationships to be developed between Africa and the Caribbean, we need a permanent and well-funded secretariat that has shared staff in both Africa and the Caribbean. We have to deal with financing. There are significant issues in the AML-CFT and anti-money laundering. So how will money get between Africa and the Caribbean if a lot of the African countries, a lot of the Caribbean countries are being blacklisted? The middle picture here is just 2 days ago. Whenever we see African delegations come to the Caribbean, and particularly in Guyana, they never interact with Africans in Guyana. They go directly to the government, even though there's an African-Caribbean trade, investment, and commerce organization in Guyana led by a Nigerian. And so when we talk about Africa to Africa-Caribbean trade, what are we really speaking about? If you look at the private sector in the Caribbean, We don't have a lot of international, multinational, and global companies. So as we engage and try to develop shared economic wealth, that shared economic wealth goes to the elites who really aren't Africans in most cases. And so what I would say is that CSME in African Continental Free Trade Zone or area, we need to create an economic secretariat to promote trade and investment. And of course, we need a twin-headed secretariat which has to ring fence individual political interests, which are natural when nation states are involved. We have a lot of nation states, and I'm very concerned when I see activities in Africa where one country is being featured when we should be featuring CARICOM. I mean, it's your own national interest, but we need to focus on CARICOM, Africa, economic development, etc. Now, my spiel is about reparations. And of course, reparations could be a dynamic foundational issue in building consolidation of African-Caribbean relationships. In Guyana, we have a monthly TV program. That TV program speaks to reparations, speaks to Africa. Of course, the African Union is going to support reparations for the Caribbean because the Caribbean has one-crop economies. We have economies that are subject to climate change. We have economies that are subject to debt. And unless we have reparations, we will not be able to have any strong Africa to Caribbean economic relationships or even cultural relationships. You know, we need to be realistic. We need to look for solutions. We need capital in the Caribbean. Without capital, our economies will not grow, with the exception of perhaps Guyana. And once we have capital through reparations, there'll be a much stronger framework for Africa-Caribbean trade and investment. Because now, as much as we would like that to happen, and as much as we speak about it, we don't have the structures, we don't have the commitment. We don't have the commitment that we saw with Pan-Africanism. What we really need today is to take that model when we have a Pan-Africanist agenda that fought for independence in Africa and ultimately in the Caribbean. We need to have that. We need our musicians to start to speak more about this. Yes, we do have records and we do have Rastafari and we do have other groups talking about Africa and Africa-Caribbean relationships. But we need to institutionalize this. We need to be Marcus Garveyite in our approach. Because as much as the learned Prime Minister said that we need to reform the existing global architecture, that's simply not going to happen without capital. And before you do that, you have to essentially build your own capacity in the Caribbean and Africa. So there was a challenge and an opportunity for the international decade. We missed it. I see recently that there's a group launching a global campaign that will incorporate 100 million people worldwide who are in the diaspora, who are people of African descent, try to incorporate corporations, etc. But in reality, we need to look at cause and effect. We need to be realistic. If we're going to ask for these things to happen, we need to put structures in place. We need to put institutions in place. We need to put a secretariat in place that will work daily, not a politician or a prime minister going to a conference and making a speech, because the people on the ground are unaffected by that. We need to have more education in the Caribbean about Africa. In Guyana, we have a Reparations Now TV program. We show an African country every month. We speak about African science. There's an incredible video, the mathematics of the pyramids. We speak about great African personalities. We talk about African entrepreneurship. There's a young man in Africa who wanted to get into cows, had no money. So on the internet, he asked people to buy a calf. So there was shares in a calf. He ended up with about 50 calves, which became cows, and then he sold it and it became profitable. So I'm saying that we do this in Guyana, where we're trying to make Africa real, where we're acknowledging African leaders, women, as well as people in the Caribbean. So if we are going to bring about an increased dynamics, if we are to talk about Africa-Caribbean integration, whether it's economic or cultural, we need to get to the people and we need to put institutions in place. And these should be institutions that are both in Africa and in the Caribbean and have personnel from both in each. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Phillips. Thank you very much, Chief. Another example of dynamism and multifacetedness as regards the engagement between Africa and the Caribbean. I thank you very much for that wide-ranging, thoughtful critique and applause of things that are happening on the reparations political engagement front. The value added of a webinar like this is not only hearing powerful, well thought out presentations by the speakers, but hearing their responses to also provocative, well thought out questions. And so now we turn to the part of the program where we will have questions. I have the advantage of having Ms. Zara, who has been collecting questions and has been sending them to me. I want to use the opportunity of this segment to bundle some questions and direct them to specific members of the panel, but with the invitation to all members of the panel who would like to comment on particular questions to join in also. So here is the first bundle of questions, the first set of questions. This question has to do with acknowledging the benefits and the positives, but asking us to reflect on what are some of the limitations, as well as what are some of the time frames for the proposals that we've been talking about. And so I want to ask each member of the panel to spend a minute or so talking about what, from the vantage point of your area of attention, you see as some limitations. We'll start with Dr. Akinola and we'll go the order in which you presented. What are some limitations? And pick, even if it's only one of the proposals you've addressed, what is a time frame for actioning? There was a critique from both Prime Minister Patterson and Mr. Phillips, as well as Ambassador Hunt. You know, we are good on what in Guyana we call the motar, a lot of talk.
No guitar.
But we're very often not good on what in Guyana they call the guitar, the action. So time frame, and I recall Dr. Akinola also talking about this. What are some limitations and what are some time frames you would attach to do some of the things you would like to see done, given your sphere reference? We'll start with Dr. Akinola, then we'll go to Professor Hunt, and then we'll go to Dr. Montooth. Over to you, Dr. Akinola.
Thank you so much. This is an interesting one. And I want to say this, that there's this every tendency for us to begin to have a universal approach to understanding the plight of Africans and even the Caribbeans. We must also note that some of the problems might be national in outlook. Africa is not just one country. We have about 52 countries in Africa. Some of these societies are aligned across different geopolitical blocks in the world, which is also a constraint to even African getting united within the region itself. So we have to be mindful of this. The recent Russian-Ukraine war has also exposed, it's not as if Africans are not united. It doesn't mean that Africans must all vote for Russia or all vote for Ukraine. But when the issues is about Africa or Africa diaspora, there is this urgency for the leaders to come together and tackle it by doing what we usually call in Africa, seeking Africa, asking Africans not to take money from the West, but we are saying that Africans should own their initiative. Let them have this ownership of the idea. Let the West support the idea. In terms of time frame, I think the time to act is yesterday. I usually say yesterday to say it is almost too late. So we must begin now before it is too late. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Hunt?
Yeah, I think I like the approach always from the bottom up. Most of our time is spent with political leaders making the initial steps to get things done. I prefer to see things start from the bottom. And in this case, if I, for example, refer to, let's say, our universities using current technology that's available to talk to each other with a particular project in mind, you know, you just choose something and say, look, I spoke with several universities in the Caribbean, and this is a document you come up with some specifics in a particular area that we'd like to see something done. And we take that to the leadership teams in the various places and look, we have looked at this particular issue and this is what we suggest that should be done. We'd like to have your buy-in to get things moving in this direction. That's the approach I think we need to have. Now, in the first consideration here is with the modern technology, you don't have to jump on a plane to start this process. Just as you have a Zoom this afternoon, we can have something started once a month in whichever sector that we want to work on with the expertise in the various places in the Caribbean and Africa. We get together, look, we want to look at this particular sector. These are the conditions that we see need to be addressed. These are the incentives we need, put it all together, get to the next level. Let the politicians now say, look, this is coming from bottom up, we got to do something. And that's where I think the break will come. Because right now what happens is everything seems to be coming from the top and it just falls through the bottom because nobody's interested. We got to start at the bottom and bring it up to the top. And then you put pressure on the system to get something done. That's my contribution.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Montooth? Limitations, time frame?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think the main limitation is that our thinking about Africa has not been completely decolonized. Our mindset, sorry, has not been completely decolonized. And so I know the process of decolonization, we had political decolonization, and I know that, that efforts are underway in both regions in Africa. But I see the process, you know, being more advanced on the African continent. And while there is a lot of progress in terms of the work that civil society groups are doing and the infrastructure that is being put in place at the governmental level to include people, to include persons and civil society in Africa, in the governance structure and all of that. I think generally, Caribbean societies, our mindsets need to be decolonized and have an appreciation for Africa. And it has to start with curriculum transformation. That's where it has to start. Africa's achievements, it cannot be limited to seminars and groups of people who are passionate and who are doing so much work to push the African agenda. I think I am a bit ashamed to say that, but the large segments of Caribbean societies, I think, are ashamed of their roots and where they're coming from. And I think that is one of the biggest limitations in terms of cultural and social. Although there is a lot happening, but I think it needs to be done. It needs to be done urgently, ASAP as of yesterday, and it has to start from the bottom up. It has to start from the preschool up in terms of advancing those kinds of you know, philosophies, education in our system.
Mm-hmm. Before I turn to Mr. Phillips, what you said, Dr. Montooth, reminded me of something that Kwame Nkrumah said back in 1954, I think. The greatest challenge of decolonization is the decolonization of the mind. And it is a truism that extends across the time and across continents. Absolutely, decolonization of the mind is the biggest challenge. Eric?
Thank you, Dr. Griffith. We need reparations within the next 5 years. The limitations, of course, is that governments in the Caribbean are hedging because they're leveraged by those in the West. And that's why we need the Africa Union to support it. And that's one of the reasons why I've been working with the traditional leaders so that they can nudge their leaders in Africa. because we have serious issues, climate change. We have a lot of issues that are not going to be solved if we don't get reparations. To me, reparations is a critical component of Caribbean civilization surviving. We have these debt economies. We have all these other issues that overwhelm us. So unless we have reparations, not just reparations in terms of financial reward, but coming back to what our doctor just said, we need reparations of the mind. We need to self-heal. We need to start loving ourselves. We need to start working with each other. We need to stop hating our Black skin. And that comes to decolonizing education.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me turn to a second, and I want to isolate this one question because I think it's a vital issue. And the question has to do with one Caribbean country that has been perennially challenged from its birth. And that country is Haiti. And the question is, what can the African Union, and I would ask you to reflect on beyond the African Union, what can African countries generally, outside of the governmental structures, do to aid Haiti's plight? And I'm going to go in the reverse order for reflection, starting with Mr. Phillips, and then going to Dr. Montooth, then Dr. Akinola, and Ambassador.
Yeah, Haiti is the truest case of Africa-Caribbean of failing. In the Caribbean, we treat Haitians as if they're taboo. Even in Guyana, where we have all this land, we wouldn't even allow them to come here, even though they're transiting to French Guyana or Brazil, simply because we are afraid of the stigma of Haiti and what foreign countries may do if we hold Haiti here. But there's also an issue of our governments being unwilling to live CSME principles. In terms of Africa, we think Africa needs to invest in Haiti. Haiti was the first republic. And yet, if we don't know history, we won't reach out to Haiti. Almost 6,000 Haitians died in the Bahamas. It was as if nothing happened. And so there must be an Africa-Caribbean solution to Haiti. And we don't have the political will to do it. It's sad.
Thank you. Dr. Montooth?
If I were in school, I would have said Dr. Griffith gave my answer, so I have nothing else to say, but I have no choice in this forum to add to what he said, because these are some of my thoughts. You know, I think, to be honest, that Haiti is our problem. It's a Caribbean problem. And while Africa needs to come on board, Caribbean people must first embrace Haiti. At the CARICOM level, look at how long we took to have Haiti as part of CARICOM. And there were all sorts of rationale and justification about the language and, you know, the history and all of that. Haitians and the other there's another Caribbean country where we treated with disdain. We have to start with us first. If Africa can see our commitment to Haiti, and I mean, there, of course, a lot has been done. I know CARICOM has done a lot in Haiti and all of that. But even on the ground, even with people, ordinary people, when we hear Haiti, and you know, I think that it has to start with us, and then we get the kind of support, we would get this kind of support that we need for Haiti. That is my honest and frank view on the matter of Haiti.
Thank you. Honesty and frankness are two requirements of participation in this seminar. Professor Hunt?
Yeah, I support all the comments raised on this matter. You know, again, presenting your own history is one of the critical things we have to do. Haiti is one of the first countries with the struggle for freedom and independence. And what they did created a whole host of possibilities in the other parts of the region. Many people don't even understand where that story started. And again, if you don't understand your history, somebody can always fool you with stupidness. Sorry, I got certain Guyanese terminology. You know, I get into the point where you have to sound like, you know, Caribbean. We got to do for ourselves things that are important. And as I said, you can't ask somebody else to come and look at your story and then tell it as if you telling your own story yourself. They got a particular bias that they come with. They come with the understanding that you are 2 degrees lower than them, and whatever you got good ain't good enough for them. Whatever they print, it ain't gonna be yours. So we have got to do the job ourselves. And as I said, to get the job done, we got to start at the bottom. The politicians got their own sphere of stuff that they're dealing with. I like grassroots operations. I like, if you can find, and they got many what I call small institutions doing a lot of good stuff in Haiti. You know, community work, you run into people from Haiti in North America who doing stuff at the place at home that you don't hear about. The Caribbean people need to join together, those out in North America and elsewhere, get linked into those associations, because in Haiti itself, they have people on the ground doing good things. And we need to link up at the bottom and then build up from that bottom going up. And there are quite a lot of things being done from what I've been talking to friends from there, that's how they get to survive in some of the difficult conditions that they find themselves in. So for me, starting at the bottom, looking for what I call the small institutions that are doing small things, or they might just be sending a couple of things home now and again, but they got linkages at the bottom that they're getting things done, little medicine, little whatever. And you can build on those small things and bring it up to something at a different level. So for me, bottom up is the solution. Controlling your own story is the solution. Don't worry the guys who keep telling you, oh yeah, they're coming and they're gonna put you on TV. No. Start your own stories yourself. I like the idea with today's technology, we should have our own stories put out by our own people. The musicians have done it. The musicians have done it, and they are going ahead, right? Everybody know what Bob Marley and Grant and everybody else. There's a cultural awakening. We need to expand that. And there's a bottom-up story, because the cultural guys talk to the people on the ground. And then, as I said, look for those small institutions to move the stuff up to the top. That's my contribution now.
Thank you. Dr. Akinola?
Thank you. Despite the fact that I'm so far from Haiti, but in some of our conversation, the issue of Haiti keeps cropping up. The same way I argue in one of my presentations somewhere that the conflict between the Tigray people and Ethiopia is a blemish to the AU, it's a blemish to Africa. The same way it is a blemish to CARICOM, it's a blemish to the Caribbean population. And I think African Union can actually assist, because I know one thing about African Union and even African leaders, they like helping people at the other side of the divide, even if their own country is in flames, I'm sorry to say that, but that's the reality. I also read recently that the humanitarian assistance required in Haiti has been monetized. They need $2 billion to fix the humanitarian crisis in Haiti. And I've seen individuals in Africa donating money to the United Nations. Just say, this is one, we are just donating this to you and they can use it the way they want. Such money can be diverted to Haiti. And I also want to say that even us academics, the civil society actors are complicit. The media practitioners are complicit because they don't report those issues on the mass media. It's not popular. The same way African scholars everywhere in Africa, you are seeing seminars on Ukraine, Russian war today, seminars tomorrow about how to manage it and all of that. Can't we do the same in regards to Haiti? How many seminars have we conducted? How many webinars have we facilitated on the crisis in Haiti? So we are all to be blamed for whatever is happening in Haiti. And people should note that it's not Haiti as a country. There are human beings living in Haiti, and our responsibility is to salvage that society from going under because they are our brothers. Thank you.
Thank you. I associate myself with all the comments by our panelists. Let me offer another bundle of questions. And as I think of this bundle of questions, I think of George Orwell's proposition in that book, Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And there's an element of this question that resonates with that Orwellian proposition. And it has to do with priorities. What are things that are considered more important than other things to be able to get the tangibles of engagement? So I want to begin again with Dr. Akinola and go back, Professor Hunt, Dr. Montoute, Mr. Williams, Ms. Eric Phillips. If you were to identify from your zone of conversation a couple of priorities to get the tangible dimension of engagement, what would those priority areas be? Everything is important, but some are going to be necessarily more important than others insofar as implementation to make success. We'll start with Dr. Akinola.
Thank you once again. And this is what I will say in brief. I imagine a situation where a country like Togo in Africa, a country like Burundi in Africa, a country like Cape Verde, I'm talking of countries of about 1 million or 500,000 or 300,000 people, are negotiating with China, are negotiating with the United States. I foresee a situation where the collective, I'm talking of either at the level of the African Union or at the level of the Caribbean community, to send representative each time that these individual countries want to negotiate with big powers. If they can't do it at individual level, now we are speaking of the two regions working together. So there could be an office, maybe a combination of stakeholders from both Africa and Caribbean, maybe a 5-member team to always try to be part of the negotiation team when any small countries or any country in Africa and Caribbean are negotiating with big powers. I read about China investment in Caribbean, and I was actually very surprised when I see how much they are spending on this small island. The question is, what are the times and the rules of engagement? We may never know. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Yes. For me, I would think that 1 or 2% of the budgets in Africa and in the Caribbean that we used to spend on military equipment that we buy from Europe and North America, take that, because you know we spend the money to shoot ourselves, right? And you're wasting money in that direction. I ain't saying you mustn't buy your stuff, but I'm saying just give me 1 or 2%, you put it together, and we identify a specific project. For me, right now, I think we need to have our own medium of talking our own stories. I think that's priority, because if you don't understand the conversation that belong to you, you can't get things done. So for me, the first thing I'd like to see happen, we take some money from the military budgets across Africa and the Caribbean, we put it into this what I call the Caribbean Africa Diaspora Network. We get everybody together and we get a program to get things organized. Let me give an example. The British had their BBC News, right? The Americans got Voice of America. We ain't got nothing to represent who we represent. So for me, for first project, 1 or 2%. I ain't asking for a lot. Let us put that together. Let us put this particular agency on the ground and get it up and running so we can all talk to each other in our own sphere and not get information from people who got your interest at heart. So for me, that's where I like to start.
Wonderful, wonderful. Dr. Montooth?
I'll start with the point I made as the first priority: decolonization of our thinking and sensitization, awareness, appreciation of what Africa has to offer, the achievements, the stellar legacy, the civilizations, the great civilizations. Even on the question of Haiti, what Haiti did for us, all of that is related. As the first independent Black republic, what Haiti did for Caribbean people. The decolonization, the awareness, and the education, that's number one. Decolonization of the curriculum and the other related things. The second thing is connectivity between the two regions. We cannot do much without connectivity. Very, very important. Flights, you name it, infrastructure to link the two regions. And the other one is TV and news networks reporting on the happenings between the two regions. Documentaries, films highlighting the life and culture and trade and investment and so, and really educating people. That these would be my three top priorities.
Thank you. Chief?
Thank you. I think we need a Marshall Plan for the Caribbean using the reparatory justice framework. Caribbean civilization is really at risk. When you look at climate change, when you look at all the issues in our economies, youth unemployment, lack of resources, the digital divide, unless we have that, we're going to struggle. I think it was Prime Minister Owen John who years ago identified this as the most critical issue facing the Caribbean. Our leaders are beating about the bush because they have their own local interests, and that's understandable. So we need to figure out how we can get a Marshall Plan, which means Africa has to support us, the traditional leaders have to support us, and our leaders have to come together and understand the risks that the Caribbean has. Once we get that Marshall Plan in place, we can deal with the airlines and all the other things that are there. But we need to realize we have a common destiny as Black people. We seem to not think about that. There's a racist architecture in the world. You look at COVID-19 and how they looked at us. We need to recognize we're on our own. And unless we become unified and we have a common cause and to fight for moral and legal rights, which is reparatory justice, we're going to keep spinning. And unfortunately, we don't have the leadership we had when there was Pan-Africanism. We need that type of leadership again.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. All good things, they say, must come to an end. And this webinar, being a wonderful thing, also has to come to an end, and time for that end fast approaches. Let me take the opportunity before I turn to Mr. Darren Winchester for the vote of thanks. Let me take the opportunity to offer my own thanks to the panelists, each of whom did a stellar job in laying out the dynamism and multifaceted elements of their own zones of engagement. But you know, the success of a webinar is not only what the panelists do, it also has to do with the work of a technical team behind the scenes. And I want to extend my appreciation to that technical team at IIR, particularly Zara, and at the marketing department of the Institute of International Relations and the University of West Indies, St. Augustine. Thank you very much for enabling us to be successful. This program will be facilitated by both the CPC, the Caribbean Policy Consortium, and the Institute of International Relations media platforms. And so I look forward to having the thoughts reflected here shared with wider audiences beyond those who were able to join us online, benefiting from the thoughts offered here. All that remains for me to do now is to invite Mr. Darren Winchester who is one of our outstanding postgraduate Diploma of International Relations students, to offer the vote of thanks. Mr. Winchester.
Thank you, Professor Griffith. Well, first of all, let me thank the panel for what was a celebration of ideas, thought, discussion, dialogue, in which we would have all been enriched and edified. And it will also contribute to our understanding and our contribution as we continue to build a different infrastructure and architecture into tomorrow. So first of all, I want to thank Professor Griffith, Ivalo Griffith, for his outstanding chairmanship during the last 2 hours of discussion. I also want to give thanks to the Honorable Percival Noel James Patterson, former Prime Minister of Jamaica and Statesman in residence, for his opening remarks. We also want to give thanks to Dr. Adeoye Akinola, the Head of Research and Teaching and Institute of Pan-African Thought. We also want to thank Professor Cyril Hunte, Professor of the Economics Department, Howard University, and former High Commissioner of Guyana to South Africa. We also want to thank Dr. Anita Montoute, the Acting Head of International Relations. And we also want to thank Mr. Eric Phillips, Chair of the Guyana Reparations Committee. Of course, we want to thank you, the respective participants who would have shared questions and ideas on the chat. And we wish you a good evening, and thank you for your participation in this little discussion. Be safe in your respective journeys home, and have a great night.
Thank you. This brings us to the end of our program. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.